I'm Elaine Viets. Some of Florida's most treasured history is invented. Ponce de Leon was not searching for the fountain of youth in Florida. The United States did not buy Florida, and oranges are native to China. Best-selling author TD Allman has written for Vanity Fair, The New York Times, and The Economist. Today on the Dead End Jobs Show, we're talking to him about his myth-busting book, Finding Florida, The True History of the Sunshine State. I'm Elaine Viets. On today's Dead End Jobs Show, we're talking to TD Allman about his new history book, Finding Florida, The True History of the Sunshine State. TD, I moved to Fort Lauderdale back in '97, but when I read your book, the state finally made sense, and Florida never makes sense to anyone. But all the Florida craziness from the election problems in 2008 and 2012 to George Zimmerman to the denial of voting rights, it just all fell into place. Now, where I live in Fort Lauderdale, I think didn't even exist in 1920. You want to start with Fort Lauderdale and the history there?
Yes, I guess I will. Your introduction, of course, was so intriguing. Actually, let's start with what you just said.
Okay.
That is what my book does. It makes Florida comprehensible. And I will go on and say that having made Florida comprehensible, it tells us an enormous amount about America and the world. And one of the points I make in the book, if you go back, when I started the book, I did not realize everything was fake, starting even before Ponce de Leon. But I'll interject here. The real founder of Florida was a Spaniard named Menendez de Avilés. Ponce made 2 brief appearances in Florida. As you said, he wasn't looking for the fountain of youth. Let's imagine Ponce had gone back to Madrid with these little vials of liquid, and he suddenly announced to everybody this was the elixir of eternal youth. He would have been handed over to the Inquisition for heresy and witchcraft immediately. And of course, you'd think our revered Florida historians might have thought this through at one point. They didn't have to wait for me to come along. Anyway, Menendez, Florida's history from the beginning is big power politics, money, and the search for wealth, and which in Florida's case is almost entirely illusory because it has no real natural resources, no metals of any kind, no gold. And that didn't stop the Spanish from searching and failing. And the King of Spain, Felipe II, he wrote in a royal decree banning further exploration in Florida. Listen to this, everybody. He said Florida's soils were too sandy and her harbors too shallow to admit a profitable settlement. That was until they found the French had started a colony near Jacksonville, the future site of Jacksonville. Menendez tore across the Atlantic. He massacred all the French. And I call this the real Florida First. It was the first massacre of white men by white men on land later to comprise part of the United States. And I say later the Spanish clung to Florida. The only thing they really built was the fort at St. Augustine. And the colony was always a drain. And I say if you start with the fort and not the fountain, you understand the whole history of Florida. And of course, I'm very pleased when the vast majority of people, having read the book, fortunately have a reaction such as yours. There is a small cabal of people who are very irritated for the same reason, but it has been a real pleasure, though it took me years and years, finally to reach this end. And I know I'll give you a chance to get a question in, but I had a sinking feeling of gratification mixed with horror when Trayvon Martin was killed, because here was the whole history of Florida recapitulating itself. And so it goes on and on.
Trayvon Martin, tell us why that Trayvon Martin recapitulated the history.
I'll put it very simply. It's always
Sure.
been okay to it's always been okay to kill black boys in Florida.
And this was legally sanctioned.
Absolutely. And what we had, there has been racial progress in the United States. There's no doubt about that. The same Florida that allowed this horror of Trayvon Martin to occur and be legitimized also voted for Barack Obama, a black man, in 2 elections. So we're dealing with it. America is always very complicated. But that said, had this happened in 1838 or 1938 or 1888, the same thing would have happened. The cops would have looked at the dead boy and said, okay, you can go home to the killer. And then on those rare occasions when the legal process plays itself out, the Florida jury acquits the guy. And let us remember, going down now into the South Florida area, what touched off those civil disturbances, riots in 1980, which traumatized, was a Florida jury acquitted a bunch of cops of killing, seriously injuring a black man and attacking him. And so all these things fit together, and we live with them. At the same time, we started with Fort Lauderdale. You want me to say what I was thinking about Fort Lauderdale this morning?
Yes, do.
Okay, I know I've known Fort Lauderdale at least since 1980 when I first went down. So that's over 30 years now. And Fort Lauderdale has done something that is extremely difficult for a community or a municipality to do. It has changed its identity. When I first went there, I went there during spring break, and it was absolutely invaded by teenagers. I can't say they were terribly rowdy, but there were a lot of beer cans around. They were teenagers. They were teenage prostitutes sitting on the park bench. And the city fathers got together, and they had a very big idea, which, there is no future in this for us except downscale. So what do? Let's turn Fort Lauderdale into the luxury yachting capital of the world. And I guess 2-3 years ago, I happened to get off I-95 and wander down the back bayous of Fort Lauderdale. I mean, you just see those millions of dollars in yachts parked in front of people's houses. That's a very interesting thing they were able to do. Now, it is an example of what goes on in Florida history all the time. Is a bunch of people get together and they decide to invent an identity for themselves. And fortunately, so far for Fort Lauderdale, that identity corresponds to a grip on reality. That is, it is next to the ocean. Rich people do like to go there. And many of the times, it doesn't. I just got back from Florida, but I had a very interesting drive the length of the state just a couple of weeks ago, driving down from Nashville through the Panhandle, and I got all the way to Frostproof, driving across from Tampa to Florida. And of course, it freezes in Frostproof, and it gets very cold there in the winter, can get, as it does all over Florida. And the denial, the force of denial in Florida is truly amazing. So I was in the gas station, and I remarked to these residents that it was funny. It was named Frostproof since it freezes in Frostproof. And to a man and a woman, I might add, they assured me that it never freezes in Frostproof. And of course, all they have to do is go and look at the thing. But no, they were convinced it never freezes in Frostproof.
That's one of the greatest selling jobs Florida has ever done, because we live in Fort Lauderdale, which is warmer than most of Florida, but it gets cold here in the winter, especially around January, February. And
that's sort of one of the things I like about Florida. I had the real experience with this. My book, which I'm hoping people will learn about today, is called Finding Florida, The True History of the Sunshine State. That's one of the things you learn after you've been interviewed a few times. Mention the name of the book.
Mention the book, yes.
And I was in Bangkok. I was in Southeast Asia doing a story for the National Geographic on Laos, which will be out, I believe, in a couple of months in the March issue. And I flew from Bangkok to Miami, straight through. And I have been working in the tropics since I was 23 years old, sweating and sweating and sweating. And I got to Miami, and it just seemed so nice and cool and delightful. And, of course, it was. Not only compared to Bangkok, it was February, and it wasn't freezing cold as it can be, but it was very pleasant. And I actually like the South Florida subtropical climate in the winter, except, even when it gets cold, what I really can't stand is the heat and humidity. But that's one of the things. One thing I'd like to say about my book is it's much better than I am. If you take the trouble to read it, it's more logical, it's clear, it's elegantly written, and you will find out a lot about the world around yourself. Let me say one more thing about books. The Miami Book Fair is coming up next month, just about a month from now, and I will be talking there, and I'm very blessed this year. I have 2 books out on Florida. My previous book, which many have generously called a classic, Miami City of the Future, has been republished in a beautiful edition by the University Press of Florida, and I have a foreword and an afterword which sort of explain everything. At least I try to.
Now let's get back to Florida here in your book and the Civil War. Actually, first of all, we never bought Florida. The United States, contrary to what the nuns taught me in school, did not pay money for Florida. So we are all illegally on this land, correct?
Well, unfortunately, Justice Scalia has a house in your listening area somewhere in Fort Lauderdale, and perhaps you could invite the Associate Justice and me on your program sometime, because he keeps saying that the federal government never changes, it never grows, we must interpret it exactly the way it is. Well, when Monroe got back from Paris, Jefferson really wanted to get Florida. He wasn't interested in Louisiana. He had thought of Louisiana. And then Monroe came back from Paris, and he said, well, we didn't get Florida, but we could pick up Louisiana for cheap. And Jefferson said, that's nice, but the federal authority does not allow us to do this. In order to do this, it would require a constitutional amendment. And Jefferson wrote out in his own hand a constitutional amendment saying that authorizing the federal government to acquire Louisiana, and this is very significant. It shows how they cared about Florida. Florida, when the time was right. Well, that was before his aides, Madison and Monroe, started working on him, and they said, well, you don't really need to do that. You really do have the authority. And in the end, Jefferson said, well, gosh darn, I guess I'll go ahead and do it. And he later wrote, I squeezed the Constitution until it cracked. So right there were the framers of the Constitution, the fathers of the Constitution. Involving Florida, you have them changing the meaning of the Constitution right then, during their own lifetimes. And then Scalia stands up and says it must be interpreted exactly as it was written at the time. Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe would have laughed Scalia out of court. So anyway, where did this myth arise? What basically happened is that the United States did basically to the Spanish in Florida what it was already doing to the Indians in the territory owned by the United States at that point, which was namely bludgeoning them out of there. Now, Florida, again, one of the things I'd never really fully understood until I finished writing this book was the true horror of slavery. And I'm glad there's this new movie out, you'll help me with the name, that seems to portray slavery as it really was, the horror that it was. But there are 2 things that are very important about it. What the United States had to transform Florida ethnographically in order to implant slavery in the North. And Spanish Florida had become a refuge for many people fleeing white American oppression. These included blacks, Indians, and mixed-race people, and even some white people. And Jackson was very irritated at this. He had a plan to bludgeon the Spanish into surrendering.
This is Andrew Jackson, the Battle of New Orleans.
Revered Andrew Jackson. I mean, someday you should do a program on Andrew Jackson. I have one of these Jackson apologists on the show, and I'll come along with my little needle and deflate his balloon. And a number of these people had gathered along the Apalachicola River. They were growing. They weren't harming anybody. And he told his assistant Gaines, after whom Gainesville is named, to go down and blow the place up. And that's exactly what Gaines did. And they slaughtered they paid so-called friendly Indians $50 a head to kill all these people. And it was later portrayed as an accident that there had been what I call the magic cannonball, which had exploded and killed these people. Now, the curiosity of this magic cannonball was, while it supposedly killed all these people, it did not destroy any of the weapons which the British had left there, and the Americans found these in unopened casks and storage places. The terrified people in the fort had not even opened the things and tried to use the weapons. Well, this taught the Seminoles the crucial lesson, which allowed them to resist the Americans really until 1858, which was never concentrate your forces against a superior firepower, the first lesson of guerrilla warfare. So this failed to dislodge the Spanish, who could be very persistent.
What you were talking about was the battle. It's the Battle of Negro Fort, which has basically been erased from Florida history. Correct?
Right. We should not call it the battle. We should call it the massacre.
The massacre of Negro Fort. Yeah.
And this is one of the events that I restore to history. I might add, parenthetically, that I restore a lot of wonderful, valiant, good people, good Floridians to history. One of them is Zephaniah Kingsley, who was living in Florida at the time the Americans came in, and he was really a brilliant social philosopher, and he had a solution to slavery and America's race problems, which was for black people and white people to engage in sexual congress. And he said this pleasurable duty would produce a new class of people. And he wrote, when conditions are proper, the resulting, that is, the children they had, are improved in intelligence, vigor, and health. And of course, I always think of that when I go to South Beach or even go to a food court or you walk around a mall, you see it in Fort Lauderdale, see these magnificent people of all different colors and shades walking around, making Florida so interesting. And of course, he was sneered at. He had to leave Florida. And he was married to a black woman, Anna Kingsley, again, a very remarkable figure. You could do a whole show on the Kingsleys. But he was totally forgotten, yet he was vindicated 150 years later, more than 100 years later.
Well, he was also the man. What I never understood, though, is that he was a man of culture, and he married a black woman who the whites made into a Moroccan princess or something strange. Madagascar princess, that's right. She couldn't just be a black slave. She had to be something exotic. Why did the two of them engage in slavery? Because that's where they made their money. Is that correct?
Well, yes, and I think indeed, they engaged in slavery for the fundamental reason that all of us are very complicated, contradictory, hypocritical people. But the other reason is their vision of slavery. Remember, slavery has existed in many, many forms across the decades. The culture of classical Rome was largely in the hands of Greek slaves who led very comfortable, interesting lives for their Roman masters. So nobody could say slavery is good, but like every form, it has more benign and more horrible forms. And the American form was especially horrible because it was linked to the Industrial Revolution, the cotton gin and the textile factories of the Midlands of England and later the United States. And there was this massive expansion of slavery between independence and the Civil War. And that's what really brought on the Civil War, which was the expansion of slavery, the insistence that slavery be expanded. And again, that's completely different, I suspect, than what you were taught in school, which was that slavery was this antique, genteel form. It wasn't anything of the sort. Now, help me get back to where, they regarded slavery more as the form like of indentured servitude. And the idea that was in 1 year or one generation or at most two, these ex-slaves, many of them biracial or mixed-race people, would then form a yeoman class in Florida that would play the stabilizing role that the poor whites did further north. And in fact, Kingsley pointed this out in his treatise. He said, unlike, say, the Carolinas or Virginia, the interior of Florida did not have a white yeoman class who could, without saying it, come to the rescue of the rich whites when they when their slaves revolted, and he wanted a biracial and mixed-race yeoman class to play that role. And what's very interesting about him, remember, this was 20 years before Marx, and he had a class as well as a race analysis of society. Kingsley should be studied in every American college and university. Of course, he's not, because he was expelled from history. Anyway, let's get back to Jackson for just a second. Or do you want to?
Well, I want to talk about some of Florida's great Civil War heroes who are excised from the state's official history, like Adam Jacoby Slemmer, and who. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about him.
Well, first of all, the great myth of the Civil War started at Charleston Harbor. The first battle of the Civil War, the first engagement of the Civil War, were at Pensacola. And one of the reasons we don't hear about this is the Union won. There were two very resourceful young U.S. Army officers there, Schlemmer, and I forget the name of the other fellow. And they, when everybody else sort of gave in to the Confederates immediately, and they said, no, we have commissions from the President of the United States to protect American property and defend the U.S. Constitution. And they refused, and they held off the Confederates until U.S. warships arrived. And this happened in January of 1861, 4 months before the famous encounter in Charleston Harbor at Fort Sumter. And again, they were very brave people. They were very resourceful. And their history was well known at the time. It was in the New York Times. I found it mentioned in magazines and books into the late 19th century. But what happens periodically is our so-called historians get together and they tidy things up and they remove all the stuff that interrupts the narrative of the gallant conquistador, followed by the Southern gentleman, followed by the visionary, followed by today, which, as you pointed out at the beginning, is totally inexplicable and impossible to understand if you approach history that way. So they were very brave, and they escaped, and Schlemmer actually died young. He was thought out in the West, and he had suffered illness during the thing, but it's a tremendous thing, and I describe it in the book, and it's one of the more interesting, how shall I put it, one of the more rousing sections of the book is how they only had a small group of people, and they held off the arrogance of the Confederates. See, I take most of your historians, I'm going to say this very frankly about Florida, the worst of these was not one of your Florida tenured professors, it was Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. They are Confederate apologists, or at least nostalgists. To the extent I take a political position in my book, it is as a loyal citizen of the United States of America. And that apparently is quite unusual in Florida histories. Until very recently, most historians sort of gave the idea they really wished the South had won the Civil War.
Well, back to the South and the Civil War, that really those politics, in a way, the South won. Give us very quickly, because we're down to 2 minutes. You had one of the best explanations for the Electoral College and why it still manages to screw up presidential politics. So can you tell us in less than 2 minutes?
I hope we do another show. We just started. Anyway, yes, I mean, what we forget is the Electoral College was set up to reward slavery. And the reason the southern states had a disproportionate number of electoral votes is that their slaves were counted. And after the Civil War, this compounded the problem because now the black people in the South, including Florida, especially Florida, who were still denied the right to vote, were counted for purposes of representation as well. And, the 2000 presidential election was the second time that Florida undid the will of the American people. The first time was in 1876. What nobody knows is that same amendment to the Constitution said that if a state denied people the right to vote, its electoral vote could be taken away. And, of course, that was never, ever done. I'd just like to conclude by saying that it has been a pleasure just dealing with Florida, and I think we all would enjoy living in Florida more and living out our lives there and understanding the world around us if we really took the trouble to understand the past.
Well, thank you, TD Allman, for talking about Finding Florida, the true history of the Sunshine State. I'm Elaine Viets, and you're listening to the Dead End Job Show.